The Colorado Plains in the autumn of 1870 stretched wide and silent beneath the rising sun, a land both cruel and beautiful where every shadow seemed to conceal stories, older than the railroads and harsher than the Civil War scars still etched across the country. Jeremiah Blackwood stood on the porch of his ranch house, coffee steaming in his hand, the familiar comfort of morning ritual wrapping around him like a blanket. He had seen hundreds of dawns here since carving his Blackwood ranch out of wilderness 15 years ago. Yet nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what appeared on the horizon that morning. A cloud of dust, moving faster and smoother than any cattle stampede, rolled across the flat expanse. Jeremiah squinted, at first believing some neighboring ranch had lost stock. But as the shape sharpened in the golden light, disbelief tightened his chest. Through the swirl of dust emerged a lone rider, not on a saddled horse, but bareback on a wild Mustang. The figure's body flowed with the animal's stride, as though horse and human were one. And behind them, as if tethered by invisible threads, thundered an entire herd of 12 untamed Mustangs, hooves, drumming a rhythm older than fences, older than towns. Jeremiah lowered his cup to the porch rail, his eyes narrowing. With a quick motion, he fetched the brass telescope his grandfather had carried through the Union lines at Shiloh. He trained the lens on the approaching spectacle, every heartbeat pounding harder as the truth sharpened. The rider was young, no more than 20, wiry and strong, with a lean build of someone forged by wilderness. Copper-toned skin caught the dawn like fire-lit bronze, and black hair streamed long and free, a banner of defiance against everything Jeremiah's men believed about taming wild animals. But it wasn't just youth or fearlessness that stole his breath. The rider was a woman. She leaned into the lead mare, guiding with movements so subtle they seemed telepathic. Her hand barely brushed the Mustang's neck. Her body alone was command enough. Every other horse obeyed as though her will was their will. No laureates. No shouting. No fight. The herd spirit was not broken. It was harmonized, fierce freedom shaped into graceful formation. "Boss, you seeing this?" a voice broke behind him. Jeremiah didn't lower the glass. Tommy Hartwell, barely more than a boy, stood at the porch rail with boots unlaced, shirt hanging loose. His eyes were wide as silver coins. "I'm seeing it," Jeremiah muttered, "but I'm not sure I believe it." Within moments, more men emerged, Colt Stevens with his weathered jaw and Magnus Rodriguez with the permanent squint of a man too long in the saddle. Their skepticism lasted only until their eyes found the impossible, a woman commanding wild horses as if born from the same earth that birthed them. The rider slowed her herd at the far boundary near the watering trough. With a motion as fluid as the Mustang's gallop, she slid to the ground. Her moccasins touched the earth without a sound. She wore simple buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt that had weathered too many seasons. Around her neck hung turquoise stones, glowing sky blue in the sun. She moved among the animals without fear, stroking flanks and whispering in a tongue none of the men recognized. Horses that would have bitten or kicked at any wrangler stood utterly still, ears forward, breathing calm, as though soothed by something beyond human comprehension. Apache Colt whispered, as if naming a ghost. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. The government had forced most Apache bands far south to reservations, yet here stood a young woman on his land, commanding what his crew had failed for weeks to capture. The situation was no longer a curiosity. It was a problem layered with politics, danger, and something else he couldn't name. The woman turned, sensing their gaze even from across the pasture. She walked toward them with the poise of someone who belonged exactly where she stood. No deference, no aggression. Up close, she looked even younger than Jeremiah first thought, perhaps 20 at most, yet her eyes carried a depth forged by hardship. "Morning," she said evenly. Her English was clear, accented by nothing but confidence. "You've got fine horses running wild on your land." Jeremiah studied her, choosing words with care. "Those Mustangs don't belong to me. Wild horses belong to whoever can catch them. Looks like you've done that better than my men." A faint smile curved her lips, startling him with its warmth. It had been 3 years since his wife Sarah's passing, and he had almost forgotten how a woman's smile could twist the heart. "Catching isn't the same as understanding," she replied. "Your men have been chasing this herd for 2 weeks. I've watched from the ridge." Jeremiah stiffened. She had been observing them unseen, perhaps for days. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ayanna. Ayanna Crowfeather." Her name rolled from her tongue like music carrying echoes of campfires and canyon winds. She regarded him with calm intelligence, waiting for his answer. "Jeremiah Blackwood," he said, finally gesturing to the spread of buildings, corrals, and pastures, the empire he had carved after the war. "This is my ranch. These are my men." She nodded politely to each, then turned back to him with eyes that seemed to weigh his soul. "Your horses are well cared for," she observed, glancing toward his prized stock. "Good bloodlines. Strong shelters. You understand domesticated animals." Her words felt less like flattery and more like a test. He bristled slightly, but answered steady. "I've worked with horses my whole life. Built this ranch from nothing." "War changes men," she said quietly, as if reading his history. "Some learn to destroy. Others learn to build. You chose building." The insight struck him harder than a fist. She had pierced to a truth he never spoke aloud, not even to Sarah. "What do you want here, Ayanna Crowfeather?" he asked. "Permission to water these horses. In exchange, I'll train them and leave half for your use." The offer landed with the weight of something rehearsed, a bargain both practical and bold. Jeremiah hesitated. Allowing her to remain meant risk, political, social, personal. But his instincts, honed in battle and business alike, told him he was standing at a crossroads. And the woman before him, with eyes like dark fire and hands that stilled wild mustangs, might just change everything. Ayanna didn't argue her case with more words. She turned from the porch and walked back to the horses, as if answering a question the earth had asked instead of a man. The herd shifted at her presence, alert but unafraid. She stopped 10 paces from the biggest of them, a coal-black stallion with a jagged blaze and eyes that had learned to trust no one. The animal's muscles bunched like coiled rope. Ayanna breathed slow, and even hands at her sides, shoulders soft attention anchored on the horse, the way you anchor a line to a post for impatient shore. The men said nothing. Wind cut across the pasture and rattled patches of dried grass. Ayanna stepped forward once. The stallion's ears, flicked, not pinned, not hostile, listening. Another step. Her weight rolled through her heels, not toward the horse, but into the ground beneath him, as if telling him the soil itself was safe. 10 breaths passed. 20. She did not chase. She did not plead. She waited until the stallion's neck lowered half an inch until his jaw relaxed enough to unclench the fear tied there. Only then did she lift her hand. "Patience," Tommy whispered, almost to himself. "Respect," Ayana answered, without glancing back, as though she'd caught his thought the way you'd catch a falling rain. The stallion moved into her touch, not away from it. If there had been a church bell anywhere on Blackwood land, it might have rung then. Instead, there was only the small sound of horsehair brushing a human palm. Ayana stroked the crest of the neck once, twice, then stepped aside, inviting the horse to follow the open space her body created. He did. Not in surrender, but in agreement. She shifted left. He flowed left. She stepped back. He came forward, curious as a child, allowed to hold a tool for the first time. Within minutes, she had a rope looped loosely as a halter, not a trap, but a conversation. Pressure and release. Ask and answer. When she dropped the rope's tension, the stallion licked, chewed, and let out a low sigh that traveled the herd like a soft fire. Colt cleared his throat, pride and disbelief rubbing raw against each other. "I've seen good hands," he said. "But that there's something else." "Different words," Ayana said gently, still moving with the stallion. "Different results. Where people say, 'breaks,' I think befriend. Where they say control, I say communicate. Same letters in the dust. New trail." Jeremiah watched her, a part of him counting profit, and time saved another part, sifting the space between her words for whatever wound had taught her to speak them. She had offered a bargain water for training half the herd each. On paper, it was generous to him. In truth, it asked him for something rarer than money trust in the teeth of gossip, courage against the wind of politics, the humility to admit he was watching a master where he expected an interloper. He imagined the conversations in town, an Apache woman riding his pastures, eating at his table, touching his horses like they were prayer beads. He imagined the faces that would tighten the hands that would drift too near their holsters when her name was spoken. She led the stallion in a small circle, then let the rope fall away. He stayed. The choice was his. That was the miracle. "How long for the lot of them?" Jeremiah asked, careful to keep his voice neutral. "Business first, the heart could reckon later." "For basic work, saddle feet, calm mind, 6 weeks," she said. "For the kind of partnership that doesn't crumble when weather and worry start shouting, 3 months. Depends on the horse. Depends on the human." She looked at him then in a way that felt like a question. "Depends on how much you want them to choose you when the gates open." Magnus, who had spent 40 years teaching horses to accept what they couldn't change, let out a short breath. 3 months, he muttered, half challenge, half prayer. "You'll have this whole place waltzing." Ayana didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth softened. "I'll have the horses listening. The waltzing is up to you." Jeremiah weighed the ledger in his head. 12 Mustangs turned into saleable stock could float a season. 6 kept on Blackwood land, trained to his hands, could reshape the ranch's future. But that wasn't what tipped him. It was the way the black stallion stood with her, not beaten down, not wary, not running the way a soldier stands beside a commander he'd march into a storm for. "You don't fake that, not in a morning, not ever." 6 weeks to start, he said at last. "We'll review at the halfway mark. Water's yours. Pasture's yours so long as my stock doesn't suffer. You coordinate with my foreman for schedules." No spooking my string or scrambling my cruise. And he paused, knowing the next words would change the shape of his days. You eat 1 meal a day at the main house. Ayana's eyes flicked. Surprise then, calculation, then something like caution. That's not necessary, she said. I have a shelter in the canyon. I can manage. It's not about managing, he said. It's about making sure the person training my horses doesn't collapse from poor food and stubborn pride. Magnus is a fine cook. You'd be a fool to miss his beans. The attempt at humor sounded a shade rougher than he intended, like a saddle not yet oiled. Non-negotiable. She studied him for a breath longer, weighing safety against exposure, independence against warmth she hadn't asked for. 1 meal, she agreed. Dawn tomorrow. We start. Dawn, he echoed. They shook hands. Her palm was dry and strong work hardened rather than delicate. A spark traveled his arm, as if a wire had been laid straight from her pulse to his. He let go first and told himself it meant nothing. It meant everything he would not name. The day unspooled into chores. Colt and Tommy dragged rails to repair a section of fence the last storm had bullied. Magnus rode the lower pasture, checking for a white face calf, rumored to have slipped the brander. Ayana watered the Mustangs and drifted among them like a slow breeze, now touching a flank, now stepping away, now asking, now releasing, until even the skittish paint gelding stopped pretending he couldn't hear her. When she finished, she cinched her bundle tight and started east on foot toward the canyon. Tommy Jeremiah said without looking at the boy saddle up. We're riding that way. Following her, Tommy asked, startled and eager. Following the wind, Jeremiah said dryly, and checking the east line. They cut a quiet trail far enough not to crowd her, close enough to see where she vanished between two shoulders of red rock. The canyon opened like a book kept closed by people who feared what reading might make them remember. Cottonwood stitched the seam along a trickle of water. Tucked in a bend where stone threw off the worst of the weather, Ayana had built a camp, simpler than a monk's cell bedroll small pit, where rocks kept heat through the night, a cache lashed high against coyotes and human hands. No extra boots. No second blanket. No waste. A life built to move when the ground shifted, which in this country it always did. She's been here a while, Tommy said, voice dropping like you do in a church. No tracks but her own. People who can live alone don't leave easy prints, Jeremiah answered, and it sounded like a thing he'd learned lately rather than long ago. They left without announcing they'd come. Some shelters you respect by not stepping inside. Back at the ranch, the sun fell through late-day gold into the sensible light of evening. Supper was stew thick with carrots and pepper bread, torn still warm coffee that could walk on its own. Ayana came at dusk, face clean, hair braided, clothes dusted but neat, carrying silence, the way some carry knives, well and without apology. Magnus, who knew a kitchen is a kind of truce, nodded her toward the long table and set a plate as if she'd sat there all her life. Tommy asked questions with a flood he could not stop. Colt asked, none seeing that the questions a man most wants answered are the ones he has to earn. What do you listen for? Tommy blurted, finally unable to keep his curiosity bridled. When you stand there with a horse like that. Ayana dipped bread into her stew. For the moment, they stop telling me what they're afraid of and start telling me what they need, she said. Those are not the same thing. Jeremiah felt the line strike him clean through. It applied to horses. It applied to towns. It applied to a widower who taught himself to prefer the predictable grief of memory over the risky ache of wanting. He found himself smiling. With half his mouth, Sarah would have teased him for that and set his spoon down to keep from fidgeting like Tommy. "Tomorrow," he said, shifting the talk back where it belonged, "we'll pen the black and the paint in the round corral. I want my men seeing your methods up close." "They'll think it's slower than roping," she said with no offense in it. "They'll think whatever they think," he returned. "I think results. If we can ship a dozen with mind steady and feet, sure I'll drink to slow." She nodded once, finished eating, and stood. Outside the sky was a bowl cooling from copper to indigo. Coyotes tuned their thin instruments beyond the northern hills. Ayanna adjusted the strap of her bundle. "Dawn," she said again. "Dawn," he answered, and watched her walk into the deepening blue until the night took her outline away. Sleep did not come easy. He lay where he always lay, in the bed that had been a home inside a home when Sarah was alive. The ceiling boards knew all his old thoughts. Tonight, the boards learned a new one, that a hand can teach a horse to choose calm, that a voice can teach a ranch to choose courage, that a heart can choose despite itself to open its gate after years of locking it tight. When the stars burned down to embers and the eastern horizon grayed, he rose with an eagerness he had not felt since he was young enough to mistake hope for certainty. He brewed coffee, thick as river mud, took 2 cups, and stepped into a morning that promised hard work and trouble in equal measures. He found he did not mind either if it meant walking the fence line between them beside the woman who could persuade a wild thing to stay without taking its wildness away. Dawn came sharp and cold, the kind of autumn morning that carried frost on its breath and painted the world silver before the sun could rise high enough to warm it. Jeremiah walked toward the eastern pasture with 2 steaming mugs of coffee boots, crunching against the brittle grass. He found Ayanna already there, her figure moving slow circles inside the round corral with the black stallion and the paint gelding. She hadn't waited for him to begin. She never did. He watched as she shifted her body weight step by step, the black circling her like a planet caught in quiet orbit. Every so often, she stopped, lowered her shoulders, and turned away. The stallion halted each time, ears flicking forward, then edged closer, curious. Trust being built one breath at a time. "Morning," Jeremiah said, offering the coffee over the rail. She looked up, face flushed, from effort strands of hair loose against her cheek. "Thank you." Her smile, rare but real, hit him like sunlight breaking fog. She took the mug, sipped, then set it outside the ring before turning back to the horses. Her entire attention returned to them as if the world beyond their hides did not exist. That kind of focus was humbling to watch. The men arrived a few minutes later, yawning and skeptical. Colt leaned on the fence, Magnus folded his arms, and Tommy perched on the rail like a boy at a carnival. "She's been at it since before light," Tommy said, admiration bright in his tone. "Look at that. He's near tame already." Colt grunted. "Near tame ain't broke. Let's see her saddle him before we start singing songs." Ayanna heard, but gave no sign of offense. Instead, she lengthened her steps, her body language guiding the paint gelding into a trot. No whip, no rope, just presence and release. The gelding trotted, steady, ears forward, tail loose. Then she slowed, turning her shoulder, and the horse slowed with her, settling into a walk as though he had read her mind. She stepped to the center, crouched slightly and extended her hand. The gelding approached, without hesitation, lowering his head until his nose brushed her palm. The crowd of men fell silent. Even Colt's jaw tightened, the disbelief wearing thin. "You see what she's doing," Magnus muttered low. "She ain't forcing him. She's inviting him. Big difference." "Inviting don't build wagons or win races," Colt replied, though the edge in his voice lacked conviction. Ayanna pulled a small coil of rope from the rail and fashioned a halter around the gelding's head. She rubbed his neck, murmured something in a tongue the men didn't understand, then rested her forehead briefly against the horse's. The gelding blew out a long sigh, body loose, tension gone. She stepped back and gestured for Jeremiah. "Your turn," she said. He blinked. "Mine." "You said you want horses that trust men. Then you must be part of this. Come in." Colt smirked. "Boss, she's asking you to dance." Jeremiah shot him a look, but pushed open the gate. He stepped into the circle, heart pounding more than he'd admit. The gelding lifted its head, eyes bright, ears twitching. "Stand easy," Ayanna said softly. "Don't reach. Don't chase. Just breathe." He did, filling his lungs with cold air, grounding his boots. The gelding's nostrils quivered, then he stepped forward, curious. When his muzzle touched Jeremiah's sleeve, a strange warmth filled the man's chest. He lifted his hand, slowly brushing the animal's neck. For a moment, there was no ranch, no men, no politics, only the simple miracle of trust offered freely. Ayanna's voice reached him. "Now you know the difference between catching and understanding." He nodded, unable to answer. Around the corral, his men watched, their skepticism softened into quiet awe. Even Colt's eyes betrayed respect. He wasn't ready to voice. The rest of the morning passed in steady rhythm. Ayanna guided both horses through groundwork, asking, releasing, rewarding. By midday, the black stallion carried a rope halter and walked calmly beside her. By afternoon, the paint accepted a blanket across his back without flinch. Every moment, the men witnessed a different kind of horsemanship, slower, yes, but producing results none of their hard-handed methods had achieved. When Ayanna finally led the pair to water, sweat darkened their coats, but peace shone in their eyes. They were not broken. They were transformed. At supper that night, the mood around the table shifted. Tommy chattered excitedly, asking about pressure and release, about body language, about whether all horses spoke the same way. Magnus nodded thoughtfully, chewing slower than usual, his pride struggling, but not unwilling to learn. Colt remained quiet, his silence less combative than contemplative. Ayanna answered questions with patience, speaking in measured tones, never boasting, never belittling. She described horses as mirrors that show us what we bring, a phrase that lingered long after plates were cleared. Later, when the others drifted to their bunks, Jeremiah found himself lingering by the fire with her. She sat across the table, hands folded, eyes reflecting the flames. He wanted to ask where she had learned, why she traveled alone, what shadows had pushed her from her people. But he didn't. He only said, "Your methods work." She inclined her head. "So does yours. For different ends." "And what end do you chase?" "Partnership," she said simply. "Not obedience. A horse that chooses to stand with you will never bolt when storms come. A horse forced will always be looking for the gate." Her words slid deeper than horses. Jeremiah felt them strike places inside her rarely opened. He thought of Sarah, of war of the choices that had built fences, both on land and in his heart. He met Ayana's gaze and found no judgment there, only steady truth. It unsettled him more than any storm. That night, in the empty bed, where memory often kept him company, he lay awake, hearing her words. Partnership, not obedience. He wondered how many fences in his life had been built out of fear rather than trust, and what it might mean to tear them down. When sleep finally claimed him, it carried not Sarah's memory, but Ayana's eyes, dark, unyielding, and full of something he could not yet name. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm unlike any Jeremiah had known in all his years of running the ranch. Every dawn he found Ayana, already at work, the mist still low in the valleys, her figure moving like a shadow between the corral rails and the restless Mustangs. She didn't need ropes, whips, or harsh voices. Her presence alone seemed to settle the herd. He brought her coffee each morning, a quiet ritual that required no words, and stood at the fence to watch until the men came to join. At first, his crew treated the whole arrangement like a sideshow. Tommy was eager, his questions spilling out like water through a broken dam. Magnus observed with the guarded silence of someone unwilling to admit he might be wrong. Colt scowled, skeptical as ever, muttering under his breath about wasted time. Yet even he, after watching Ayana coax the paint gelding into accepting his first saddle without a single buck, began to hold his tongue. The horses weren't just calm, they were willing. That difference gnawed at every man who had spent years breaking animals through sweat and struggle. One morning, as Ayana worked the black stallion, Colt leaned close to Jeremiah and muttered, "She'll ruin him if she keeps babying him. Big ones like that need a firm hand." Yet moments later, the stallion lowered his head, followed Ayana's step, and allowed her to lift a blanket onto his back as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Colt turned away, jaw tight, and said nothing more. By the second week, the Mustangs moved like students eager for lessons. Ayana guided them with her body, showing them circles, halts, and changes of direction. She let them puzzle out tasks until the answers were their own. Each success was rewarded not with grain or force, but with release, the freedom to feel safe. Jeremiah realized she wasn't training animals, she was shaping relationships. And as he watched, he wondered how much of his own life had been lived by breaking things into submission rather than inviting them to choose. The ranch itself began to shift. The men grew quieter during work, more observant, less prone to cursing when horses resisted. Tommy tried her techniques, first mimicking her stances with clumsy eagerness. Magnus, despite his pride, started softening his grip on the reins. Even Colt, though he refused to admit it, began watching her with the wary respect of one gunfighter sizing up another. Ayana's influence spread like water through dry earth, soaking into every corner. At supper, the conversations deepened. She spoke of horses, not as property, but as partners, each with a soul shaped by storms and seasons. She told stories of her grandfather teaching her to listen to the earth, to the silence between hoofbeats, to the fear that lived in prey animals, and how to soothe it. Her words were simple, but they carried weight as though drawn from stone. The men listened at first reluctantly, then hungrily. Jeremiah listened most of all, though he spoke the least. And slowly the silences that had haunted his evenings since Sarah's death began to change. When Ayana sat at the table, those silences weren't empty anymore. They were filled with the quiet companionship of someone who didn't demand explanations yet understood more than words could tell. He found himself watching the way her eyes softened, When she looked at the horses, the way her laughter, rare but real, lit the room like firelight. He told himself it was admiration for her skill, nothing more. But deep down he knew better. It was on the 14th day, just as the sun broke the horizon in a blaze of orange, that Ayana mentioned the visitors. She said it calmly without drama, while adjusting a rope halter on the paint gelding. 3 men came to my camp last evening, she told Jeremiah as he passed her a mug of coffee. Not locals. They asked questions about Apache movements, about raids. The words made his stomach knot. He tried to keep his tone even. What kind of question? The kind that assumes guilt before truth, she replied. Her eyes remained on the horse, her hand steady. I told them I've been living alone for months, that I have no contact with raiding parties. And did they believe you? She shrugged. Doesn't matter. Belief is not what men like that seek. They want someone to blame. Jeremiah felt a hot rush of anger, sharper than he'd known since the war. That they would question her here, on his land, after all she had given, boiled his blood. If this becomes trouble, she said softly, almost gently, I can leave. You don't need the burden of me. The thought of her leaving struck him harder than he expected. In 2 short weeks, she had woven herself into the fabric of his days, her voice at supper, her presence in the corral, her rare smile that softened the weight he carried. He realized with startling clarity that the idea of her walking away left a hollow ache in his chest. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. This ranch is your home until the horses are trained. Longer if you want. Let me worry about trouble. She looked at him then, her dark eyes searching his face for truth. For a flicker of a moment, something unguarded showed a flash of gratitude, perhaps even relief before her mask slipped back into calm. She gave a small nod. Then we continue. But in the silence that followed, Jeremiah understood something dangerous. She wasn't just teaching him about horses. She was teaching him about trust, about partnership, about opening gates he had long kept closed. And he wasn't sure he could stop learning, even if it meant risking everything. The ranch had known visits from lawmen before, territorial marshals checking brands, tax collectors riding through, even railroad men sniffing for land rights. But that morning, when 3 strangers appeared at the main house, the air shifted heavier than storm clouds. Jeremiah spotted them first, from the porch horses' dust-caked saddles, plain but serviceable rifles slung with casual readiness. Their posture was not that of neighbors come calling. These were men accustomed to authority, or at least accustomed to being obeyed. Ayana was in the corral, working the paint gelding through soft circles when Tommy came riding up, fast, face pale. Boss, visitors. Say they want a word about Apache activity. The words sliced clean through the morning calm. Jeremiah felt the men around him stiffen, Colt narrowing his eyes, Magnus cursing under his breath. He gave Tommy a curt nod. Keep steady. Don't crowd her. Let me handle this. Yet he knew, even as he said it, that Ayana's presence couldn't be hidden. Hiding would only make her look guilty. She must have heard the exchange, because she left the corral gate open, walked toward them with shoulders straight, and joined Jeremiah just as the strangers dismounted. The leader was a wiry man with graying hair and the calculating gaze of someone trained to read lies. Deputy Marshal William Crawford, he introduced himself briskly, jerking his chin toward the others. Mr. Hayes, Mr. Porter? We're investigating reports of Apache raids in this area. Understand you've got an Apache woman here. Jeremiah kept his tone even. That's correct. Ayanna Crowfeather. She's been training wild horses for me the past 2 weeks. Crawford's eyes shifted to her measuring. Miss Crowfeather, there've been thefts, livestock, missing, property damaged. Evidence points to raiding parties. Do you have information that might help? Ayanna met his gaze without flinch. No, sir. I've lived alone for months, no contact with raiding parties. My work is here with these horses. Her voice carried neither fear nor arrogance, just fact. Living alone is unusual for an Apache woman, Crawford pressed. What brought you to this situation? Jeremiah tensed, sensing her discomfort. She paused, a flicker of something unreadable passing across her face before she answered. Personal circumstances. Family matters resolved. Nothing connected to raids. Hayes, younger and meaner in manner, stepped forward. Family matters like being cast out for helping raiders or planning raids yourself. His words dripped poison. Jeremiah's jaw clenched, but before he could speak, Ayanna's calm voice cut through. Family matters like refusing an arranged marriage. I left by choice. To pursue work I believe in. Training horses is that work. Porter, the third man, finally spoke low, deliberate. Hard story to verify. Then verify it by my work here, Ayanna countered. She gestured to the corral, where the Mustangs stood calmly, heads lowered, eyes bright but not fearful. 12 wild horses, nearly uncatchable. Ask Mr. Blackwood about their progress in 2 weeks. Raiders don't spend time teaching Mustangs partnership. Crawford studied her, then turned to Jeremiah. You vouch for her character. Jeremiah's answer came quick, firm. I do. She's the most skilled horse trainer I've seen, and her conduct has been professional every moment. I can account for her presence daily since she arrived. The deputy marshal's gaze lingered on him, weighing. That's a lot of trust to place in someone you've only just met. Jeremiah didn't blink. I've bred horses 15 years. I know skill and honesty when I see it. Her work speaks louder than rumor. Hayes snorted. Rumor or not, the canyon country hides plenty. Good place for raiders to slip through unseen. Ayanna's chin lifted. You're welcome to search my shelter. You'll find 1 bedroll, a fire pit, simple supplies. No weapons beyond hunting tools, no stolen cattle, no signs of company. The 3 men exchanged looks. Porter shrugged faintly. Crawford exhaled. That won't be necessary. Your explanation suffices for now. But we'll be patrolling closer. Any unusual activity will expect cooperation. Of course, Jeremiah replied, though his jaw ached from restraint. They mounted, but Hayes leaned down, fixing Jeremiah with a thin smile. Friendly advice, Mr. Blackwood. Be careful who you tie your name to. Politics out here don't look kindly on folks who blur lines. Jeremiah's reply was steady steel. I know politics fine, and I know judging by race instead of character is exactly what keeps conflict alive. The men rode off, leaving dust and tension behind them. Silence hung heavy until Tommy let out the breath he'd been holding. Could have gone worse, he muttered. Could have gone better, Jeremiah said, still staring after them. He turned to Ayanna. She hadn't moved, but her posture was taut, coiled like a bowstring. They'll be back, she said simply. He nodded. Then let them come. We've nothing to hide. But that night, As he lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, Jeremiah knew the truth was more complicated. She had nothing to hide, but the world wasn't built to see her innocence. And with each day, she stayed his stake in her safety grew deeper than he'd ever intended. He wondered whether protecting her was about justice, or whether it had become something more dangerous to admit protecting the woman herself, not just what she represented. 3 weeks passed after the marshal's visit, but the shadow of that morning never truly left. The ranch hands pretended at ease, yet every rider who crested the ridge set nerves on edge. Gossip traveled faster than any horse. Neighbors in town would have heard by now that Jeremiah Blackwood harbored an Apache woman under his roof. Some would sneer. Others would whisper. A few might take it upon themselves to act. Jeremiah knew this country justice often carried no scales, only a rope. Ayanna carried herself as if none of it mattered. She worked each dawn with the horses patient as river stone guiding them into balance and quiet strength. The black stallion now walked to her hand without halter. The paint gelding carried saddle and rider without a buck. Even the red mare, once vicious enough to kick Magnus into broken ribs, stood for her feet to be cleaned ears forward. The transformation was a miracle that no skeptic could ignore. Yet the miracle did nothing to soften the eyes of men who had already chosen their verdict. And on one brittle morning, as the frost still clung to the edges of the corral fence, trouble came riding. Jeremiah was checking the north pasture fence when the sound of galloping reached him. Urgency thrummed in the hoofbeats, wild and uneven. He spurred his bay gelding up the ridge, telescope ready. Below in the eastern valley, Ayanna stood cornered against a canyon wall. 4 mounted men surrounded her, their shapes sharp against the pale stone. One had already dismounted, rifle in hand, moving closer like a predator. Jeremiah's gut clenched. These weren't marshals. Their posture was wrong, too loose, too hungry. Bounty hunters, or worse, vigilantes drawn by the scent of reward. Their shouts carried up to him accusations of raids, demands that she surrendered, jeers that her being Apache was guilt enough. Ayanna's voice rose clear, defiant. I told you I've stolen nothing. I've trained horses, nothing more. Look for the real thieves if justice matters to you. The men laughed, circling tighter. Justice don't matter when you're Apache, one spat. That's wrong enough for most folks. Memories from the war surged in Jeremiah's chest, memories of mobs and men who believed race was reason enough for a bullet. He would not stand by again. He guided his horse wide circling to approach from the west, where rocks cloaked his movement. The Winchester across his saddle felt heavy but sure in his hands, an old companion from darker years. He crept closer till the range was 50 yards and every man in the valley lay within his sights. That's far enough. His voice cracked like a whip across the canyon. The men startled, spinning their mounts, rifles half raised. Ayanna remained behind her boulder, calm but watchful. Well, Blackwood, the heavy-set rider sneered, didn't expect you here. We're just questioning this Apache about Patterson's stolen stock. I can see what you're doing, Jeremiah replied, rifle steady. And it stops now. Miss Crowfeather is under my protection. She's no raider. The man chuckled darkly. Protection, eh? Pretty Apache woman living on your land, eating your food. What kind of protections that the insinuation was crude, meant to shame. Rage lit Jeremiah's blood. The kind that keeps innocents safe from cowards with guns. Now mount up and get off my land before I show you what kind of soldier I used to be. The leader narrowed his eyes. 4 against 1 ain't odds you want Blackwood. You're right, Jeremiah said coldly. I'm not here for a fair fight. I'm here to win. The standoff hung heavy silence, stretched taut as a wire. Then Ayanna stepped out from behind the boulder, hands lifted, voice calm as water. Stop. Nobody needs to die over this. You want questions answered, then ask them, but without pointing rifles. Ayanna, get back behind cover, Jeremiah ordered, but she shook her head. It ends now, she said firmly. Then, to the men you want the truth, I've been in that canyon every night for a month. Ask Blackwood. He'll vouch for me. Raiders don't spend their days teaching horses. The leader sneered, but doubt flickered in his eyes. Patterson's missing cattle was serious money, but Ayanna's calm refusal and Jeremiah's steady rifle left him no easy path forward. Finally, he spat into the dust. Fine. We'll take this to the ranch house. With witnesses. Agreed, Jeremiah said. But not here, not like this. The threat ebbed, but the danger had only changed shape. As the men turned their horses toward Blackwood Ranch, Jeremiah lowered his rifle slowly, his heart still hammering. He rode to Ayanna's side, meeting her gaze. For the first time, he saw something beneath her calm, a shadow of weariness, of someone too used to being hunted for what she was, rather than what she had done. You didn't need to step out, he said quietly. Her eyes held his. If you had fired, blood would have stained this land. Sometimes, courage is not pulling the trigger. Sometimes, it's standing where they can see you and refusing to bend. The words cut deeper than any bullet. And as they rode back together, Jeremiah realized the truth. He could no longer deny this was no longer about business, no longer about horses. It was about a bond forged in fire and threat, a bond that would either redeem them both or burn everything he had built to ash. The 4 riders arrived at the ranch house, with dust still clinging to their coats and suspicion burning in their eyes. The sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the yard, and every man on Blackwood Ranch felt the tension coil tighter than a lariat rope. Colt, Magnus, and Tommy stood near the porch hands, hovering close to sidearms, but they obeyed Jeremiah's unspoken command to hold steady. Violence here would stain the land in ways no rain could wash clean. Crawford, the deputy marshal, wasn't with this group. These were different men, harder, less bound by law, more bound by coin. They dismounted with deliberate slowness, boots crunching against gravel eyes, flicking between Ayanna and the corral where the Mustangs shifted restlessly. The heavy-set leader spat into the dirt and sneered. All right, Blackwood. You want this done proper. We'll do it here. Let's hear your Apache girl explain how Patterson's cattle vanished without a trace. Ayanna stood beside the porch steps, posture, straight face calm. If fear gnawed at her, it left no mark on her features. I've told you already, she said, voice steady, carrying just enough for all to hear. I've been training horses. Ask your own eyes, see the work I've done. Ask these men. She gestured toward the crew. Magnus cleared his throat, reluctant but honest. I've been here every day. She's with those horses from dawn till dusk. Ain't time to be rustling cattle, even if she wanted to. Colt hesitated, jaw clenched, then added grudgingly, the herd's calmer now than I've ever seen. That black stallion, no man here could get close to him. She did. That's where her hours go. Tommy, eager, almost desperate to defend her, blurted, "She couldn't have stolen anything. She's been teaching me how to stand still, how to breathe so the horses come to you." Raiders don't talk like that. Raiders don't laugh at supper when Magnus burns the beans. The men laughed harshly at Tommy's boyish outburst, but the edges of their suspicion dulled slightly. Ayanna stepped forward, then holding her ground as if the entire prairie had gathered beneath her feet. "You blame me because it is easier than searching for truth? But look at me. Alone. One horse. A shelter in the canyon. Do you think I could move 50 head of cattle by myself, or do you simply need someone to point at so you can stop being afraid?" The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. The leader's eyes narrowed. He didn't like logic unraveling his excuse for violence. "What I think," he growled, "is that Apache lies are smoother than their knives. Maybe you had help. Maybe you signaled your people from that canyon of yours." Jaramir's voice cut in sharp as a crack of thunder. "Enough. You've made your accusations. Now hear the truth. Ayanna Crowfeather has been under my roof for weeks. I've watched her work every morning, every night. If you're hunting, raiders look elsewhere. But if you're here to harass a woman because of her blood, then you're on the wrong land." The yard fell silent. Even the Mustangs' stilled ears pricked. The men shifted uneasily, unused to being challenged so directly. The heavy-set one scowled. "You're willing to stake your name on her innocence." "I already have," Jaramir said. His hand didn't waver from the rifle resting against the porch rail. His voice carried the calm of someone who had seen battle and survived. "This ranch runs on trust, not cowardice. She stays. She works. And she's under my protection." For a moment, no one moved. The riders weighed the risks for against a ranch full of armed men, the certainty of blood spilled if they pressed further. Their leader finally spat again, this time with frustration. "Fine. But don't say we didn't warn you, Blackwood. Folks talk. Politics run deeper than fences. Keep her here. You'll be drawing heat you don't want." "Let them talk," Jaramir said coldly. "Words won't change the truth." With that, the men mounted up and rode off, their silhouettes shrinking against the horizon. The tension broke only when the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Ayanna exhaled slowly, her composure unshaken. She turned to Jaramir. "You didn't have to risk yourself like that." "Yes," he replied, surprising even himself. "I did." The men drifted back to work, muttering about fences and feed, but their eyes carried a new weight. They had seen their boss stake his reputation on an Apache woman. Some felt respect. Some felt worry. None could deny that something had shifted. That night, over supper, Ayanna sat quieter than usual. The firelight traced shadows along her face, revealing the fatigue of constant vigilance. Jaramir wanted to tell her she was safe, but he knew safety was a word too thin for this land. Instead, he simply poured her another cup of coffee and sat across from her, letting silence become the bridge between them. Later, lying awake, he realized he had crossed a line without meaning to. Protecting her wasn't business anymore. It wasn't even duty. It was something far more personal, something that made his chest tighten whenever she entered a room. And though he didn't yet dare name it, he knew it was already too late to turn back. The days following the confrontation carried a different kind of weight across Blackwood Ranch. Every creak of saddle leather, every echo of hoofbeats from the distant ridges seemed sharper, more charged. The men worked with quieter mouths and quicker eyes, glancing often toward the horizon as though expecting riders to crest it at any moment. Yet in the heart of that tension, Ayana continued her work with the horses as if nothing outside the corral mattered. Jeremiah found himself rising earlier, sometimes before dawn itself, drawn by the need to see her in those first pale hours, when the mist still clung to the grass and the Mustangs stamped the ground in restless energy. She moved among them with the calm certainty of someone born to the task, her hands steady, her voice low, her body language shaping theirs. Each morning, she transformed chaos into order, fear into trust, and he realized the lessons were as much for him as for the horses. One morning, he stepped into the corral at her invitation. She handed him the rope tied loosely to the black stallion's halter. "Don't hold it tight," she instructed. "Let him feel your steadiness, not your grip. He knows the difference." Jeremiah obeyed, loosening his hand until the rope was little more than a line between them. The stallion snorted, tossing his head once, then lowered it, stepping into his space without fear. A strange warmth filled Jeremiah's chest. For years he had prided himself on control, on fences-built deals, struck herds managed. Yet here with this animal, and under Ayana's gaze, he felt the deeper strength of trust freely given. "You see," she murmured, "when you stop demanding, you begin receiving." He met her eyes, and for a moment it felt as though she weren't talking about horses at all. By the third week, the transformation of the herd was undeniable. The paint gelding accepted a rider's weight, calm and steady. The red mare allowed Tommy to handle her feet with no trace of violence. Even the black stallion, once uncatchable, now followed Ayana like a shadow, his massive form softened by her patience. The men who had doubted her methods now admitted quietly, often grudgingly, that she had achieved in weeks what others couldn't in months. But while the ranch grew stronger, whispers from town grew louder. Riders passing through carried rumors that Blackwood Ranch harbored an Apache woman, that she was more than just a horse trainer, that perhaps she was a spy for raiders or worse. Crawford's patrols increased, and each sight of government riders on the ridges made the men tense. At supper, the subject could no longer be avoided. Colt slammed his cup on the table one evening and said, "Boss, it ain't my business to question you, but word in town's getting ugly. Folks don't like the thought of an Apache living here, no matter what she's done with the horses." Jeremiah set his fork down slowly. "Let folks talk. Words don't run this ranch. Results do." Colt met his eyes. "Results don't stop bullets, Jeremiah. I've seen what happens when people decide justice means skin color. You're staking more than the ranch on her." Before Jeremiah could answer, Ayana spoke. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of long years. "He stakes nothing that I do not already stake myself. Every day I stand here, I risk more than land or reputation. I risk my life, but I will not run from it. Not again." The silence after her words was thick. Magnus muttered something about finishing his stew and left the table. Tommy stared at her with open admiration. Colt shook his head, but said no more. Jeremiah only looked at her, and in her eyes, he saw both the fire that had kept her alive and the sorrow of battles she had fought alone. Later, when the others had gone to their bunks, Jeremiah lingered by the fire with her. "You don't have to carry this burden alone," he said softly. She studied him, her face lit by the glow of embers. "I've carried it since I was a child. Alone is all I know." Not anymore, he said more firmly than he intended. As long as you're here, you're not alone. For a heartbeat, something softened in her features, as if the armor she wore had cracked just enough to let him glimpse the woman beneath, the one who longed for belonging, for peace, for something more than survival. But just as quickly she looked away, her composure returning. Then, tomorrow we keep working. Horses don't wait for feelings. He almost smiled at her deflection, but the truth was undeniable. Each day tied them closer, not just through the herd, but through the quiet recognition of two souls, scarred by loss, searching for something they had never expected to find. And still beyond the ranch, the world pressed in. Rumors thickened. Strangers passed by more often, watching too closely. Patterson's stolen cattle remained unaccounted for, and the bounty on Apache suspects grew heavier with each retelling. Jeremiah knew it was only a matter of time before words became actions, before suspicion became accusation. One evening, as he walked the fence line beneath a sky painted with dying fire, he saw Ayanna leaning against a post, her gaze fixed westward where the land fell into shadow. He joined her in silence. After a long moment, she said, "Storm's coming." He glanced at the horizon. The sky was clear. "I don't see one." "You will," she replied. "Storms don't always show in the clouds first. Sometimes they show in people's eyes." Jeremiah knew she was right. The question wasn't whether the storm would break, but whether the two of them could stand together when it did. The first sign of trouble was the silence. It fell across the ranch one afternoon in late October when the air carried the sharp bite of oncoming winter. The men were repairing the eastern fence line, Ayanna was working the black stallion near the corral, and Jeremiah was checking the stock by the creek. Then, as if someone had pulled a curtain across the plains, the birds went quiet, the horses stiffened, and every ear turned east. Moments later, 4 riders appeared, cutting across the ridge like storm clouds on horseback. Jeremiah's stomach hardened. These weren't marshals this time. He recognized 2 of the men from the earlier confrontation, the heavyset leader with cruelty in his eyes, and the younger one with a reckless grin. Their company had doubled now, riding 4 strong rifles strapped in plain view. Bounty hunters, plain and simple. They weren't here for questions. They were here for payment. Ayanna noticed them too. She stilled the stallion with a hand on his neck, whispering until the great beast lowered his head. Then she stepped back, tying him off with a calmness that belied the tension rolling through the yard. When the riders drew close, dust swirling around their hooves, she met them with a steady gaze. "Well, Blackwood," the heavyset one called, reining in. "Seems the rumors about you keeping an Apache woman weren't just smoke. Patterson's still missing cattle. The territory's offering a fine price for anyone delivering proof or suspects." His gaze slid to Ayanna like a snake. "She'll do just fine." Jeremiah stepped forward, rifle across his arm, but not raised. "You'll do nothing here. Ayanna Crowfeather is under my protection. She's no raider." The younger rider snorted. "Funny thing about protection. It don't mean much when folks are already convinced. All it takes is a rope and a tree, and nobody asks questions after." The words ignited memories Jeremiah had fought to bury: battlefield lynchings, lawless mobs, the stink of injustice wrapped in smoke. His voice came out colder than steel. "You'll not string a rope on my land? Not while I draw breath." The heavyset man sneered. "Then maybe you're part of it." Maybe you've been hiding cattle in those canyons, feeding her lies to keep suspicion off your own men. Colt, who had been standing nearby, stiffened. That's a damned lie. Is it the man challenged, spitting into the dirt? We could ride out there right now, find your so-called shelter, see what's hiding under the blankets. Ayana's voice cut through before Jeremiah could answer. Go, then. You'll find a fire pit, a bedroll, nothing else. No stolen cattle, no raiding party. Just proof that I've been living alone quietly while you waste your days chasing shadows. Her calm defiance rattled them more than anger would have. The heavy-set man's jaw worked, struggling between pride and doubt. He glanced at his companions, then back at Jeremiah. Doesn't matter. The bounty don't pay for excuses. It pays for bodies. Dead or alive. In an instant, hands twitched toward rifles. The ranch yard became a powder keg. Tommy's face drained of color, his hand frozen above his holster. Magnus muttered a curse, shifting his weight, as though ready to draw. Colt's eyes burned like flint. Ayana stood unmoving, her hands empty, her posture upright, as if daring them to strike. Jeremiah moved first, not with bullets, but with words sharp enough to slice. You pull a trigger here, and you'll find out how quick a Union veteran can still aim. I fought for years against men who thought skin made someone less human. I buried too many to let that poison take root on my land. If you want to fight, you'll have one. But I promise you, you won't right away. The silence that followed was thick with the taste of iron. The younger rider's smirk faltered. The heavy-set leader hesitated, eyes darting between Jeremiah's steady rifle and the quiet fury in the faces of the ranch hands. The odds no longer looked as sure as they'd imagined. Finally, he spat again, disgusted. Not worth the blood. Not today. He jerked his reins, turning his horse sharply. But mark my words, Blackwood. The law don't stay blind forever. When it comes down on her, you'll be dragged under too. The four riders wheeled and pounded away, leaving dust and tension in their wake. The men exhaled slowly, relief mingling with the knowledge that the threat had only been delayed, not erased. Ayana looked at Jeremiah, her expression unreadable. You put yourself between me and their guns. Where else would I stand? He asked quietly. For the first time since she'd come, something broke in her composure. Not fear, not sorrow, but a flicker of gratitude so raw it almost looked like pain. She turned away quickly, walking back toward the horses. That night, supper was eaten in uneasy silence. Even Tommy, usually unable to keep quiet, had no words. Afterward, Jeremiah stepped out onto the porch, staring at the stars, while the autumn wind bit cold against his skin. Ayana joined him a moment later, her moccasins silent on the boards. They won't stop, she said softly. I know, he replied. You should send me away. It would be easier for you. Safer. He turned to her, meeting her eyes in the starlight. Easier isn't always right. Safer isn't always worth living. You stay. That's final. The words hung between them, carrying a weight neither dared to name. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled, and beneath the cold, infinite sweep of stars, Jeremiah knew with sudden clarity that the storm Ayana had warned of was closer than ever, and that he would face it at her side, no matter the cost. The next week dragged heavy with tension. Life on the ranch continued. Fences mended, feed hauled, horses worked, but beneath every task lay the awareness that danger stalked closer with each passing day. The bounty hunters hadn't returned, but their threats lingered like the smell of gunpowder after a shot. Worse, word from town confirmed what Jeremiah feared. Ayana's presence had become the favorite topic at saloons, barbershops, and church pews alike. Tommy brought the news, first riding back from town, with eyes wide and words spilling out. "They're saying you've lost your senses, boss. That she's got you bewitched, turned you against your own kind. Patterson himself told the marshal you're hiding stolen cattle for her." Colt swore, slamming a fist into the corral rail. Figures Patterson stir the pot. Man never liked you outbidding him for contracts, Jeremiah. Now he sees a chance to ruin you clean. Magnus only muttered, "Fools don't need truth when they've got a story they like better." Jeremiah listened in silence, his jaw set, eyes shadowed. He knew all too well how fast suspicion hardened into judgment and judgment into violence. Ayana, when told of the rumors, merely inclined her head. It was always going to come to this. "You took me in, now you share my burden." Her calmness should have reassured him, but instead it stoked the fire inside. "This isn't your burden alone," he said sharply. "And I won't let Patterson or any other coward paint you guilty just because they need someone to blame." That night he rode into town himself, Ayana watching silently from the porch as he left. The saloon was crowded, smoke-thick voices, louder than sense. As soon as he stepped through the door, the room shifted. Eyes turned, whispers rose. Patterson sat at a corner table, smug as a cat with cream. "Well, Blackwood," Patterson drawled, when Jeremiah approached, "come to bring us that Apache girl of yours. Heard there's a fair price on her head. Could make back some of what you've lost." Jeremiah's voice was iron. "I haven't lost a damn thing, Patterson. Least of all my honor. You've been spreading lies, and you'll answer for them." A murmur rippled through the room. Men shifted uneasily. Some leaned forward, eager for blood. Patterson smirked, leaning back. "Lies, or maybe truths you don't want to face. 50 head of cattle gone. Raiders to blame. And here you are, housing one under your roof. You expect us to believe it's coincidence." Jeremiah leaned over the table close enough that Patterson flinched despite himself. "I expect you to believe your own eyes. You've seen the Mustangs she's training. You've heard my men speak. If you had half the courage, you pretend you'd ride with me at dawn and see for yourself instead of poisoning the air with your cowardice." The room held its breath. Finally, a wiry rancher at the bar spoke. "Man's got a point, Patterson. Proof's in the work. If she's training horses, like they say, maybe she ain't got time for raiding." Others muttered agreement, though not all. Patterson's face darkened. "You think folks'll trust the word of a woman like her over mine? You're a fool, Blackwood. You'll burn with her when the time comes." Jeremiah straightened his hand, resting lightly on the butt of his holstered Colt. His voice dropped, calm and dangerous. "I buried men who thought like you in Virginia, Patterson. Don't think I won't bury another in Colorado." The silence that followed was thick as molasses. Patterson blanched, then looked away. The crowd broke into low murmurs again, divided, unsettled. Jeremiah left without another word, his boots striking hard against the saloon floor. When he returned to the ranch, Ayana was still awake, waiting on the porch. He told her only part of what had passed, but she read the rest in his eyes. "You've painted a target on yourself," she said softly. "Maybe so," he admitted. but better me than you. Her gaze held his steady and fierce. You don't understand. There is no better me than you. The storm doesn't choose, it takes whoever stands in its path. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she added more quietly, Thank you, Jeremiah. Not for protecting me, for standing beside me. The words struck deeper than he expected, stirring something that had lain dormant since Sarah's death. As he looked at her in the moonlight, he realized the truth he had been denying. This was no longer just about justice or even survival. This was about her. About the woman who had walked into his life with wild horses at her heels and shaken every certainty he'd built since the war. And though the storm pressed closer, though danger gathered like thunderheads over the plains, Jeremiah knew one thing with absolute clarity: he would not let her face it alone. The first snow came early that year. By morning, a thin white crust covered the ground, muting the crunch of boots and softening the outline of the corrals. Steam rose from the horses' backs as they shifted restlessly, stamping against the cold. Ayanna moved among them with her usual calm, brushing frost from manes, her voice low and soothing. Yet, beneath the quiet beauty of the snow, danger pulsed like a hidden river. The townsfolk had grown restless. Word reached the ranch that Patterson and his allies were stirring meetings at the church and saloon alike, fanning fears of Apache raids and accusing Jeremiah of harboring the enemy. Some believed it, others only kept silent. Silence was dangerous, too. It meant consent when mobs began to form. Magnus brought the warning. Riding back from town, his coat dusted white, his face carved in worry, he reported Patterson's calling for a committee. Says if the marshal won't deal with it, the town will. You know what that means, Jeremiah. Vigilantes. Colt cursed low. Means they'll come with torches, not questions. Tommy Pale glanced toward Ayanna, where she worked in the corral. We can't let 'em touch her. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. They'll not lay a hand on her while I breathe. That night, as the men gathered in the bunkhouse, Ayanna entered quietly. The firelight caught the turquoise at her throat, glimmering like captured sky. She listened as Magnus and Colt argued about whether to prepare defenses or ride to the marshal. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but carrying. You can't fight shadows with guns. If they come with torches, no bullet will change their minds. Colt bristled. So we just let 'em drag you off? No, she replied, her eyes steady. We show them truth. Let them see the horses, see the work. Let them see me not as Apache, but as a trainer, a woman who asks only to be left in peace. It won't convince all of them, but it may convince enough. Jeremiah studied her, struck again by her courage. And if it doesn't? He asked. Then we fight, she said simply, but only if there is no other path. The following evening, the path came sooner than anyone wished. Snow still lay thick when the sound of many hooves shattered the silence. Lantern light flickered across the ridge, moving steadily toward the ranch. Men's voices carried in the cold air, angry, restless, the sound of a crowd looking for blood. Jeremiah stepped onto the porch, rifle slung across his shoulder, Magnus and Colt flanking him. Tommy stood trembling, but determined, his hand hovering over his revolver. Ayanna walked out last, her moccasins soundless on the boards. She stood not behind them, but beside Jeremiah, her posture tall, unyielding. The crowd halted in the yard, 20 strong. Patterson was at the front, his smugness replaced with righteous fury. Blackwood, he bellowed, you've been warned. We won't have Apache spies hiding here stealing stock and putting us all at risk. Hand her over and we'll spare your ranch." Jeremir's reply was calm, but it carried across the yard like a cannon. "You want her? You'll ride through me first. She's no spy, no thief. She's a better hand than any you've hired, and you damn well know it." Murmurs rippled through the men. Some shifted uneasily, their anger faltering under the weight of his certainty. But Patterson pressed forward. Fine words. "But this isn't about horses. It's about survival. We can't afford to trust her kind." Ayana's voice rose, then clear and fierce, silencing even the restless murmurs. "Your survival is not threatened by me. You fear me because it is easier than facing your own failings. You lost cattle because someone watched you careless. Someone with time and knowledge. Not me." She gestured toward the corral where the Mustangs stood calm in the snow, their breath rising like smoke. "I've built something here that your fear can't touch. Look at them. Look at what patience and respect create. That is my work. That is my truth." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Even the horses seemed to listen. Then a rancher at the back muttered, "She's right. Those are wild Mustangs. And look at them standing like they've been trained for years." Another man nodded reluctantly. "Never seen anything like it." The spell nearly held, but Patterson broke it, his voice sharp with desperation. "Don't be fools. Tricks won't change blood. She's Apache, and that's all that matters." Jeremir lifted his rifle, the motion slow but deliberate. "The only blood spilled here tonight will be yours, Patterson, if you take one more step toward her." The standoff stretched breath, steaming in the cold. Some men lowered their eyes, shifting back in their saddles, unwilling to press further. Others muttered uncertain. Patterson raged, but he saw the tide turning, saw the unwillingness in their faces. With a curse, he spat into the snow. "This ain't over, Blackwood. You're tying yourself to her fate. When she falls, you'll fall too." He wheeled his horse, the crowd following reluctantly, their anger dulled by doubt. Slowly, the lantern lights receded into the distance, leaving the ranch in silence once more. Ayana stood still, her breath clouding in the icy air. Jeremir lowered his rifle, but his hand trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the weight of what had nearly come. He turned to her, words rough with unspoken feeling. "You faced them down like steel." Her gaze held his soft and fierce all at once. "I've lived my life facing down storms, Jeremir. But tonight, I didn't face it alone." Something in his chest broke. Then, something hardened since Sarah's death. He wanted to reach for her, to tell her what burned in his heart. But the moment passed fragile as frost. Instead, he simply said, "We'll face whatever comes. Together." And for the first time in years, he felt the truth of the word together. The following days carried the stillness of a land holding its breath. Snow melted into mud by afternoon, then froze hard again by night. The Mustangs trained steadily under Ayana's hand, their progress undeniable, yet the men felt the air tighten like a rope being drawn. Patterson had not won his crowd, but he had not surrendered either. He was a man too proud to let go of a grudge, and pride was more dangerous than bullets. Magnus warned it plain one evening as they sat around the fire. "Patterson won't stop at words. Men like him don't take shame easy. He'll strike again, but not from the front. He'll come sneaking, and he won't come alone. Jeremiah nodded grimly. Then we'll be ready. Ayana listened in silence, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. At last she said, "You can guard against men. But what you must guard harder against is fear. Fear makes allies turn suspicious, friends turn quiet. If Patterson cannot break your gates, he will try to break your trust." Her words proved true sooner than any of them wished. 2 days later, tracks were found along the northern pasture cattle, driven through snow toward the timberline. It was Patterson's claim made flesh, more stock missing. The men muttered darkly, suspicion thick in the cold air. Even loyal Colt looked uneasy as he studied the trail. "Could be raiders," Magnus said. "Or just drifters looking for beef." Or Patterson's voice rang out as he appeared on horseback at the ridge, flanked by 3 armed men. "It could be your Apache witch calling her people from the canyon." The accusation dropped like stone. Jeremiah strode forward, fury simmering. "You'll not ride onto my land spitting lies." Patterson grinned wolfishly. "Then prove it. Show us her camp. Show us there ain't cattle hidden among those rocks. Unless you're afraid what we might find." Ayana's face was calm, though Jeremiah saw the shadow pass through her eyes. "Let them come," she said quietly. "Truth has no fear of light." Against every instinct, Jeremiah allowed it. He would not give Patterson the satisfaction of appearing to hide. Together they rode toward the canyon, a tense procession under a sky heavy with gray. When they reached Ayana's shelter, the search began. Blankets, a fire pit, a handful of tools, dried meat, a stack of herbs. Nothing more. No cattle, no weapons, no sign of raiders. Patterson's men overturned every rock, pawed through every basket, but found only the quiet life of a woman surviving alone. At last, Patterson spat. "Too neat. Too clean. She's hiding something." Jeremiah stepped forward, eyes blazing. "What she's hiding is the strength to live alone in a land that would rather see her dead. What she's hiding is more honesty than you'll ever know. You found nothing because there is nothing. You're a coward hunting ghosts because you can't admit you lost cattle to thieves too clever for you." The words cut deep. Patterson's face purpled, his men shifting uneasily. One muttered, "Boss, maybe he's right. There ain't nothing here." But Patterson wasn't ready to yield. He turned his fury on Ayana. "You think you can charm horses and men alike, but it won't save you? This ranch'll burn before I let an Apache claim innocence." Before Jeremiah could respond, Ayana stepped forward, her voice quiet, but slicing through the canyon like wind. "Burn if you must, Patterson. Fire cannot touch what is true. You see me as enemy because you cannot face your own weakness. But I will not bend to your hatred. Not now, not ever." For a moment, even Patterson faltered under her gaze. Rage warred with uncertainty, and though he turned away with a curse, the doubt in his men's faces was plain. They rode back toward town, leaving only churned snow and heavy silence behind. When they were gone, Jeremiah released a breath he hadn't known he held. "You stood straighter than any soldier," he said to her. Ayana looked at him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. "I have stood straighter than fear my whole life. But today I did not stand alone." Their eyes held, and in that moment, the truth they had both avoided pressed closer. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition, longing, the slow breaking of walls built by grief and by years of mistrust. He wanted to reach for her, to draw her close against the cold, but fear of what it would mean held him still. That night, the ranch was quiet, but sleep did not come easy. Jeremiah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the fire in her eyes when she faced Patterson. For years since Sarah's death, his nights had been filled only with ghosts. Tonight, for the first time, they were filled with the living presence of a woman whose courage had changed everything he thought he knew. In her small shelter across the yard, Ayanna lay awake, too, staring at the flicker of firelight. She remembered his words, his defense, the way his voice had carried like iron against the mob. She had lived her life braced for betrayal, yet here was a man who had chosen again and again to stand beside her, against logic, against safety, against the world. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of deeper storms. But in the quiet spaces of the night, something stronger than fear was taking root, a bond neither of them could deny much longer. Winter deepened, and with it came the promise of blood. Snow fell heavier, muffling the world, but not the dangers that crept closer each day. On Blackwood Ranch, work carried on horses trained, cattle-fed, fences patched. Yet beneath every routine lay the gnawing sense that Patterson was not finished. His pride had been wounded in front of men he sought to command, and men like Patterson did not forgive humiliation. They repaid it with fire. It began with small signs. A fence cut during the night. Hoof prints circling the ranch from riders who never showed their faces. A feed shed broken into, supplies stolen. Each act small enough to deny, yet sharp enough to remind them they were being hunted. Colt growled that it was Patterson's men. Magnus muttered it was the work of cowards. Tommy asked if maybe they should ride to the marshal, but Jeremiah shook his head. The marshal listens to Patterson's coin. No law will protect us. We stand our own ground. Ayanna's voice was quiet but firm. This is no longer about horses or even stolen cattle. It is about power. Patterson fears what he cannot control, and he cannot control me. That is why he will not stop. Her words proved true soon after. One moonless night, the ranch awoke to the crackle of fire. Flames leapt high from the northern hay barn, lighting the sky with orange fury. The men rushed to form a bucket-lined snow, melting to steam as they fought the blaze. Ayanna darted among them, fearless, her braid whipping in the wind as she dragged buckets alongside the men. Together they saved the barn's frame, though half the hay was lost to smoke and ash. When the fire at last smoldered, Jeremiah stood in the ruin, fists clenched. This was no accident. Colt spat into the snow, Patterson's mark all over it. Tommy's young voice trembled. If they'll burn hay, what's to stop them from burning the house? Jeremiah said nothing, but his silence was heavier than words. He turned to Ayanna, her face streaked with soot, her eyes fierce despite exhaustion. You were right. This isn't about cattle anymore. It's about breaking us. Ayanna met his gaze. Then we must not break. The next days became a vigil. The men kept rifles near lanterns, lit horses, saddled for a quick defense. The Mustangs, sensing the unease, grew restless, yet calmed whenever Ayanna walked among them. Her presence steadied not only the animals, but the men too. In her quiet determination, they found something Patterson's hatred could not extinguish. Still, the storm came. One afternoon, as snow fell thick and heavy, riders appeared on the ridge, 6 this time. Patterson at the front, flanked by hard-eyed men with rifles ready. They descended slowly, deliberately, making no effort to hide their intent. Jeremiah stepped forward, his men behind him, Ayanna at his side. The snow muffled every sound but the crunch of hooves and the creak of leather. Patterson reined in just short of the corral. His grin was cruel. "This ends tonight, Blackwood. You had your chance to hand her over. Instead, you spit in the town's face. You chose her over your own kind. Now you'll pay." Jeremiah's voice was low, steady as a drumbeat. "You've brought fire and lies. Now you bring rifles. But hear me, Patterson, if you cross this yard, you won't leave it." The two men locked eyes, the weight of years and pride colliding in that frozen silence. Then Patterson spat, raising his hand. His men began to fan out rifles, shifting toward the porch where Ayanna stood. Before Jeremiah could act, Ayanna stepped forward, her voice slicing through the storm. "You call me thief, spy, enemy. But you know the truth, Patterson. Your cattle were stolen by white men, not Apache. Men with wagons, men with maps of your land. Men who watched you grow careless. You blame me because you fear admitting your own failure." Patterson barked a laugh. "Fine words. But who'll believe you, a woman, and Apache no one?" Ayanna's chin lifted. "Then let the horses speak." She whistled sharply. From the corral, the black stallion surged forward, ears pinned, muscles coiled. The Mustangs followed a tide of raw power. With only subtle gestures, Ayanna directed them, their hooves pounding the snow, circling the riders like a living wall. The hunters' horses, spooked eyes rolling, refusing to hold steady against the wild herd's press. Patterson cursed, fighting his reins, fury twisting his face. "Devil woman." Jeremiah raised his rifle. "No, horsewoman. And you'd do well to remember it." The standoff teetered on the edge of chaos. Patterson's men struggled with their mounts, fear rising. Magnus and Colt leveled rifles, Tommy trembling but steady beside them. The herd moved with Ayanna's will, pressing the invaders back step by step. At last, Patterson saw the truth. 6 men against a ranch, defended by rifles' will, and a herd tamed by something he couldn't comprehend. His sneer faltered, replaced with bitter calculation. With a curse, he yanked his reins, wheeling his horse. "This ain't over, Blackwood. You've chosen your side. When the territory comes for her, you'll fall with her." One by one, his men followed, driven back by Mustang fury and ranch rifles. Their silhouettes faded into the snow, leaving silence behind. Ayanna exhaled, her hand still lifted, the stallion calm at her side. Jeremiah lowered his rifle slowly, his heart pounding not from fear, but from awe. He turned to her, words rough in his throat. "You saved us." Her eyes met his soft, despite the storm. "We saved each other." And for the first time, he let himself imagine what it meant, that perhaps their bond was not just survival, not just partnership, but something deeper. Something worth risking everything for. The ranch breathed uneasily in the days after Patterson's failed attack. Snow lay deep across the fields, the world muffled and still, but beneath that calm ran a current of unease. The men kept rifles closer now, eyes drifting often to the horizon. Each creak of ice in the trees, each distant hoofbeat on frozen ground, set nerves taut. Yet within that tension, something else stirred, something quieter, but no less powerful. Jeremiah noticed it first in the way Ayanna's presence eased the men. Tommy, who once flushed red and stammered near her, now sought her advice on handling the younger colts. Magnus, gruff and stubborn, nodded with genuine respect when she corrected his rough handling of the bay mare. Even Colt, suspicious at first, began to tip his hat when she passed, a gesture of acceptance as sure as any oath. The herd itself was proof beyond argument. The Mustangs, once wild chaos, now moved with discipline and grace. Ayanna worked them daily in the snow, guiding their energy, shaping their trust. Watching her, Jeremiah felt a quiet awe, an awe that extended beyond horsemanship into something harder to name. The firelight in her eyes when she worked, the quiet determination in her posture, the rare smile that transformed her face, these were becoming as much a part of the ranch as the fences and barns themselves. One evening after supper, Jeremiah lingered on the porch, the cold air biting, but his thoughts restless. Ayanna joined him, silent, at first gazing at the stars that burned sharp above the winter plains. At last she spoke. "The herd will be ready soon. In another month, they'll ride as well as any trained stock." Jeremiah nodded. "You've done more in weeks than most men could do in years." "I can't deny it." She turned to him, her face unreadable in the starlight. "When they're ready, I'll leave." The words struck him harder than any bullet. "Leave," he repeated too quickly. "Yes." The deal was simple: training for shelter. "When it's done, I move on. I've stayed too long already." A silence fell heavy as snow. Jeremiah gripped the railing, his breath clouding. "And go where? Back to a reservation that cast you out to towns that see only your blood, not your skill. You've built something here, Ayanna. Something worth more than any deal." She looked away, her voice soft but edged with steel. "You don't understand. Staying means taking more from you than I was ever meant to. It means putting you in danger every day. Patterson will not stop. Men like him never do. If I stay, you'll lose everything you built." Jeremiah stepped closer, the cold between them melting in the heat of his words. "I've already lost everything once. My wife, my peace, my certainty. I won't lose again by sending away the one person who's given this place life again." Ayanna's eyes shone, torn between fear and something deeper. "You think this is life, Jeremiah? This is survival. Nothing more." "No," he said fiercely. "This is more. You've shown me what it means to build instead of break. To trust instead of command. To feel again. Don't tell me it's just survival, Ayanna. Not when every morning I wake and look for you before I draw breath." The confession hung in the frozen air, raw and undeniable. For a long moment, Ayanna said nothing. Then she stepped closer, close enough he could see the silver of frost caught in her braid. Her hand lifted as if to touch his face, then hesitated, trembling. "I swore never to let myself need anyone again," she whispered. "Need makes you weak. Need gives others power to hurt you." Jeremiah caught her hand gently, his voice steady. "Or need makes you stronger because you're no longer carrying the weight alone." Her eyes met his, dark and endless. For the first time, the walls she carried like armor cracked. In that space, he saw the truth, the fear of loss, the scars of exile, but also the fierce, unyielding hope of a woman who had survived against all odds. They stood like that breath, mingling in the cold, until at last she let her hand rest against his cheek. The touch was light, hesitant, but it carried more power than any kiss. Then, as quickly as it came, she pulled back, her voice trembling. "If we cross this line, there is no going back. Do you understand?" Jaramir's answer was simple, unflinching. "I've been waiting for something worth not going back for." The words silenced them both. They did not kiss, not yet, but the promise hung heavy between them, stronger than any vow. Inside, the fire crackled. Outside, snow fell soft across the land. And somewhere beyond the ridge, Patterson nursed his hatred, planning his next strike. But in that moment, on that porch, Jaramir and Ayanna stood side by side, no longer just allies, no longer just partners. Something deeper bound them now, something no storm could easily break. The storm broke on a night colder than iron. The wind howled across the plains, rattling shutters, driving snow sideways in sheets. The men huddled in the bunkhouse, rifles stacked close, fire burning hot. Jaramir paced the porch coat, pulled tight, every instinct screaming that the quiet would not last. Ayanna stood with him, her eyes narrowed against the storm, her body still as stone. It came just past midnight, the sound of hooves muffled by snow, but too many to mistake. Lanterns flared through the darkness, moving fast. Patterson had returned, and this time he had brought more than a handful of men. A dozen riders, maybe more, cutting through the storm like wolves. Their shadows stretched long and menacing across the yard. "Get ready," Jaramir growled, shouldering his Winchester. The bunkhouse door flew open as Colt Magnus and Tommy spilled out weapons, ready, faces grim. The Mustangs whinnied in the corral, stamping in agitation, sensing the danger as surely as the men. Patterson reined in at the edge of the yard, his face lit by lantern glow, twisted in fury. "This ends tonight. Blackwood, no more speeches, no more tricks. Hand her over or we burn you out and bury the ashes." Jaramir stepped forward into the lantern-light snow, whipping around him, rifle steady. "You'll not touch her. You want fire? Then come and see how fast I'll put you under it." The men behind Patterson shifted, some eager, others uneasy. Even with their numbers, they knew Blackwood's aim and the iron will of the ranch hands. But Patterson raised his hand, high, teeth bared. "No more waiting, burn it." Two riders leapt down, carrying torches. They lit against lantern flames. The wind bent the fire sideways, but it held. They advanced toward the barn, snow crunching under their boots. Before Jaramir could fire, Ayanna's voice rang out clear and fierce as a trumpet. "Stop." She strode into the yard, her buckskin leggings catching snow, her hair lashing in the wind. The Mustangs pressed against the corral fence, watching her. With a single sharp whistle, she flung open the gate. The herd burst forth like thunder hooves, pounding, eyes wild, but guided by her calm presence. The torches wavered as the riders' horses panicked. The Mustangs surged around them, circling tight, driving them back. Patterson's men shouted, cursing, struggling to control mounts that no longer obeyed. The storm, the fire, the wild herd, it was chaos. In the swirl, Patterson's eyes locked on Ayanna. Hatred flared, and he spurred his horse forward, pistol raised. "I'll end you myself, witch." Jaramir's rifle snapped to his shoulder, but the storm threw snow into his eyes, blinding his shot. Before he could fire, Ayanna moved, sidestepping the charging horse with the grace of lightning. She clapped her hands sharply, a signal only the stallion knew. The black giant surged forward, slamming into Patterson's mount with earth-shaking force. Patterson crashed into the snow, his pistol skittering away. The black stallion reared above him, hooves striking the air. For a breathless instant, death hung inches away. Then Ayana stepped forward, hand raised. "Enough," she commanded. The stallion froze, then dropped to the snow eyes, blazing but obedient. Patterson scrambled back, face white with terror, the arrogance stripped away. Around them his men faltered. Some had already turned their horses, fleeing into the storm. Others sat stunned, torches, extinguished rifles useless. Jeremiah strode forward, rifle still steady. He loomed over Patterson, who now knelt in the snow, wet and broken. "You brought war to my land, Patterson. You brought hate to my door. But you'll not bring it again. Leave now, or the snow takes you." Patterson's lips trembled, rage fighting with fear. At last, he spat into the snow, climbed onto a riderless horse, and fled. The few who remained followed their lanterns, vanishing into the blizzard until the ranch stood silent again. The men cheered raggedly, voices shaking with exhaustion and relief. But Jeremiah turned to Ayana, his chest pounding, his heart raw. She stood in the stormlight hair, wild breath, steaming the black stallion at her side. Never had she looked more powerful or more fragile. He stepped closer, voice low but certain. "It's over. You saved us." Her eyes met his, dark and shining. "We saved each other." For a long moment, the storm howled around them, but neither moved. Then, with a courage born not of defiance but of need, Jeremiah reached for her hand. This time she did not pull away. Their fingers clasped rough palms, fitting together like pieces long waiting to join. In that touch was every unspoken word, every fear faced, every choice made. It was promise. It was home. The storm raged, but within the circle of their joined hands, there was warmth stronger than fire, stronger than hate, stronger even than the endless winter sky. And for the first time since loss had hollowed his life, Jeremiah Blackwood felt not just survival, but something he had thought gone forever: hope.